Ave Maria in the Afternoon is a co-production of Ave Maria Radio and EWTN Radio and carried across the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network. Welcome to Ave Maria in the Afternoon, examining the world through the lens of faith from the heart of the Church to help us navigate the culture. Here's Dr. Marcus Peter.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us on this hour of Ave Maria in the Afternoon. I'm Marcus Peter. I'm coming to you from the Good News Cruise put on by Ave Maria Radio and Corporate Travel, and it's a wondrous time of reviving and revitalizing married life and rediscovering the meaning of the sacrament in light of church teaching. This hour, we will be talking firstly with Cheryl Hughes about this beautiful book, Archbishop Sheen, the Convert Maker, published by Ignatius Press. It's a very touching book, to say the least. You go through the entire book and you really come to a sense of getting to know the man who, I argue for many of us, and not all of us listening, had some kind of an impact into the kind of Catholics that we are right now. Venerable Fulton Sheen was one of America's great spiritual leaders of the last century, one of the most prolific Catholic voices and influences in the sphere of the media. He literally had an Emmy-winning television show that reached millions across the world. He was a household name throughout the 1950s and 60s. His greatest gift, however, and therefore the greatest call that he found himself having, was in finding the lost sheep. He saw himself as an evangelist going after those who were desperately in need of the saving grace of Jesus Christ, and that motivated him. That drove him. And so Cheryl Hughes will talk with us about how he was completely gripped. His heart was completely taken by the joy of the gospel and therefore the work of evangelization for the salvation of souls. We then speak with our friend Carl Olson about the 7 challenges that we are going to see arise immediately in terms of implementation of the things that have been put into our minds by virtue of the final document on the Synod on Synodality. The second phase of the Synod on Synodality wrapped up in October. Its supporters are celebrating it as a historic launching point for the next phase of the Church into this new year ahead and beyond. But many are skeptical, and rightly so. The skepticism really comes from the fact that we still are unsure about how this implementation process ought to look. So we examine these challenges to synodality with Carl Olson. And hopefully, as we keep rediscovering a notion of clarity when it comes to the Synod on Synodality and what it means to be a listening church, and as we try to capture more and more in terms of concrete clarity what Pope Francis wants, may we see a revitalization of salvation here in the church and in the world. All this after the headlines.
Thank you, Marcus, and good afternoon, everyone. This is your Ave Maria Radio News for Tuesday, January 7th. It's the feast of St. Raymond of Pennafort. And today's news is brought to you by Ave Maria University. Your vocation location is at avemaria.edu. Pope Francis has named Sister Simona Brambilla as the new prefect of the Dicastery of Consecrated Life and Societies of Apostolic Life. The 59-year-old Italian nun will be in charge of the Vatican office that oversees all Catholic religious orders. Brambilla has worked within the Dicastery for just over a year, having served as secretary since October 2023. Prior to that, she led the Consolata Missionary Sisters Institute for 12 years. The death toll has risen to over 120 after a powerful earthquake struck a remote region of Tibet in southern China. That's according to local media. The U.S. Geological Survey says it hit close to the border with Nepal just after 9 a.m. local time and was felt as far away as India and Bangladesh. Visitors at Mount Everest Base Camp also reported shaking. President-elect Trump's attempt to delay sentencing in his New York hush money case is being denied. On Tuesday, a New York appeals court judge rejected Trump's request for an emergency order to halt Friday's scheduled sentencing. Last year, Trump was found guilty on 34 counts in connection to hush money payments to porn star Stormy Daniels before the 2016 election. And Peter Yarrow of Peter, Paul, and Mary is dead. He reportedly died of bladder cancer at his home in New York City. The 1960s folk trio were instrumental in helping popularize the work of Bob Dylan. Yarrow co-wrote the song Puff the Magic Dragon. From the AveMariaRadio.net news desk, I'm Dan McGraw.
Good afternoon, welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. Archbishop Fulton Sheen, to this day, is remembered as one of the most noteworthy media evangelists in recent Catholic history. And a recent book highlights essentially a kind of memoir. It highlights those ups and downs in his journey of the work of evangelization, but also some of his personal struggles in his life as a first priest, then bishop, and evangelist. The author is Cheryl C.D. Hughes. She holds a PhD in historical theology from Durham University in England. And the title of the book that we're talking about is Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen, Convert Maker. Cheryl, thank you for joining us. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you so much. And how are you today?
I'm well, thank you. And I'm very appreciative that you wrote this book. And I want to start by saying that you did a good job of not canonizing the man. You really highlighted the very genuine human struggles that he underwent in his entire journey, not just in priesthood, but even generally in the work of evangelization.
Thank you. Yeah, one of the things he used to say was that God didn't call angels to be priests, he called men.
Yeah, that's true. And I think that really highlights everything he grappled with. So let's begin this narrative here. Many of us know him, especially from his TV work. In Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, I remember when I was studying my way into the church, someone introduced me to the recordings that he had put out on Your Life is Worth Living, and that was part of my study into the Catholic Church. And I know, and this was long, of course, after he had passed, but let's begin the narrative that he didn't always set out to be one of the most prominent evangelists of the modern age, especially in light of being in front of a camera. That wasn't his goal at all.
Well, heavens no. He was a priest, and a priest, one of his main goals is to win souls. He said, if we're not saving souls, nothing is saved. And I think he really starts out to be the best he can be.
Yeah.
And eventually, on radio, it took him very high. We might, because life is worth living, and we're in a video culture. We forget that the radio was a huge influence, and he was on the radio for 20-some years with his preaching. And so that really predates the television. So he came into radio in its golden age when it was reaching to every household it possibly could. His audience was enormous. And then it exploded when he went on to television. I don't know that he could have foreseen that he would be the celebrity priest that he turned out to be.
Yeah. And I think that's important to highlight that, yes, he began this work on radio, and it was really his advent into television work that really cast him into the global light. But in a very particular way, this was a man who was in love with Christ and therefore in love with the souls that Christ had put in his care. He was so concerned about the salvation of souls. And as you mentioned, meditation before the Eucharistic Christ was the essential life force, if you will, for how he powered through the rest of the day.
I think people probably would think that somebody who's a celebrity priest somehow might not have all that priestly of a prayer life, but his prayer life was really, really important to him, and he started that hour of devotion when he was in college or early on in seminary. He also was commended to the Virgin Mary by his mother, and then again he also offers himself to the Virgin Mary. And he was in love.
Yeah.
In fact, he calls Mary the world's first love. He was in love with Jesus and in love with Mary, and therefore really in love with all of God's people. Really, he was a kind soul. He reached out to everybody, and while he might have been a great and essentially wealthy celebrity, though he gave away all of his money, he also was there for the down and out, for the lepers. I mean, he just was amazing with lepers.
And he did that especially in his work in the Philippines. And I kind of don't want to jump ahead in the narrative there because that's such a pivotal part of his story. So if you don't mind, I'd like to backtrack a little to think about those early years of his life in parish ministry and his eventual entry into the work of radio apostolate.
He did not have much of a life in parish ministry. I mean, he became an archbishop, but in fact, he was only ever assigned to a parish for 8 months after he finished all of his graduate school and came back to the United States. He went to graduate school in Belgium, and when he came back he had offers to teach at Oxford and Louvain and NYU, and he said to his bishop, "Which one shall I take?" And the bishop said, "Come home." And he sent him to a very small inner city parish. Yeah. And I think that's the only time he ever really lived in a rectory for any length of time. Mm-hmm. So his early parish life was important to him because this was a very poor parish, and he went around and he visited every single person on the church rolls, and then every single person in the neighborhood who wasn't on the church rolls. And he began to make converts right there. So he was sort of set in his ways. He was going to be winning souls however he could.
Yep. And if he couldn't utilize the media, just put him on a soapbox, he would have stood at the side of the street preaching the gospel. And
somebody said if he came out wearing a barrel and reading the New York Yellow Pages, they would have loved him anyway.
I could see that. I could truly see that. Now, he was a character, but he was extremely serious about his prayer life. And as you say, I really think that formed the foundation of every single thing he did for the rest of his life once he became ordained as a priest. Now, Cheryl, one of the things that I think we often take for granted is even in his work in radio apostolate, he was very careful. He's an extremely erudite man. This was a man who was brilliant theologically and philosophically. But he was very concerned about making sure that the work he did benefited the salvation of souls above all else. And this was a almost constant struggle for him to make sure that while he dove the depths of this faith, he made it so that everyone could partake of it.
Well, that is being a brilliant teacher.
Yeah.
One of the things he said he always tried to do with the group was to find out where they were kind of on the same level, and then he would go from there. So he would identify the familiar, and then use that as a springboard into something much more esoteric, much more theologically deep. Mm-hmm. But even when he did things that were theologically deep on the radio and later on television, he was able to distill them down so that the common person could understand them. And that's a gift. That's the gift of a really good teacher, to be able to do that. He said, I get on the radio, later television, up to the classroom, in the classroom, because he taught so many years at the University of the Catholic University of America. I do this to win souls.
Yeah. How much?
Very clear about what he wanted.
How much do you think the parallel apostolate of people like Frank Sheed of Sheed and Ward aided in this great boom of catechesis that took place? Because they were both really booming in their own ways. Sheed and Ward through publishing, and Archbishop Fulton Sheen through his work of evangelization in the media, but also in writing. Yes.
The young Frank Sheed, I don't think cared much for Bishop Sheen, which is shocking. But I do think that there were many people in and out of the church who resented him, who were envious of him. I mean, the young Frank Sheed said that he didn't think that Fulton Sheen had anything to do with the conversion of Claire Booth Luce, and that's ridiculous.
Well, we are continuing this conversation with Cheryl Hughes, author of Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen, Convert Maker, published by Ignatius Press. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.
St. Therese once told her sister Celine that when we trust ourselves and not God, our soul becomes barren and incapable of virtue. Her remedy? External works of charity. We all try to do it on our own sometimes without asking for God's help. At St. Paul Evangelization, we suggest sharing the gospel with someone who needs it. Check out streetevangelization.com to find a team near you where you can share the love of Jesus. If there isn't one in your area yet, perhaps God is calling you to start a team in your city. To learn more, visit streetevangelization.com.
The wisdom of Mother Angelica.
I told him about the woman who came to me and said her two children hadn't spoken to each other for 2 years. Their grandma died, and she was very wealthy. She left half to each one. She said they're arguing over a commode. She said it's inlaid. Can you imagine being in hell and somebody saying to you, "What are you here for?"
EWTN. Live truth. Live Catholic.
Do you have a teenager at home who's full of potential? Too often the world is telling you to be content with mediocrity instead of raising respectful and responsible young adults with strong character. Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Ray. If you need some help, not only to navigate those teen years, but to really enjoy them, check out my book, Standing Strong, Good Discipline Makes Great Teens, as well as my other books on the store page at AveMariaRadio.net.
Ave Maria in the Afternoon is underwritten by the following nonprofit organization: Real Estate for Life. Buying or selling your home or business property? Real Estate for Life can connect you with one of 1,400 pro-life real estate agents around the world. When Real Estate for Life receives a referral fee, they donate 70% to Ave Maria Radio and Human Life International. More information at realestateforlife.org or 877-LIFE-US1. That's realestateforlife.org.
Good afternoon, welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. My guest, Cheryl Hughes, author of Archbishop Fulton Sheen, Convert Maker, published by Ignatius Press. Cheryl, we were talking earlier about how despite his best efforts, there were inevitably people who were anywhere from jealous of him to even resenting him. And yet he took that in stride, and he even highlighted that as part of his own journey. He, especially being made bishop, he realized that he had become a little worldly. He had to pull back into a true sense of humility of the office. So this was not a man who was unaware of his own failings in the great calling that God had on his life.
No, he certainly wasn't unaware. He, I think, really the beginning of his humility was when he went on his trip around Asia with Cardinal Spellman.
Mm-hmm.
He saw poverty there that he'd never seen in the United States. He saw illness there like he'd never seen anyplace else. And I think he came home and he had to recalibrate just a bit. And then eventually he becomes a bishop in Rochester, and that was not a happy occasion for him necessarily. Mm-hmm. Though, as in hindsight and irony, much of what he proposed there actually came into being. But he was moving too fast, having never been in a parish before. You know, being a regular priest, He really wasn't quite sure how to react to priests, and coming off of his great contributions to the propagation of the faith. Mm-hmm. Obviously, that's the world missions. He just got even more humble as time went on.
Yeah, and this became very clear in how he spoke about his own bishopric, even simple things like his pectoral cross being turned into a crucifix, the ring that he had, he turned it into, he changed it out for a silver ring with the Blessed Mother in mother of pearl. So he was doing these smaller things to become tangible reminders of who he ought to be and what he's actually called to do.
You know, he also wore a hair shirt.
Mm.
Somewhere towards the end. So I think of his prayer life as being very Lenten.
Mm-hmm.
if we were to pray, which he always did, if we were to give alms, which he always did, and fast, he hardly ever ate anything. He gave away absolutely everything that he ever earned from his 60 books and hundreds of pamphlets that were published. And he eventually wore the hair shirt, I think, as a reminder to himself that he is not the great man. Of course, he says, when he became bishop, he loved the softness of the prayer do and loved the idea that he would get preferential treatment, and he thought that was just, something that made him, and it took him a very short while to realize that he wasn't this great creature. As he was talking earlier, I said that God didn't call angels to be priests, he called men, and he realized that he was a very fallible man, and I think tried everything he could to keep his feet on the ground at the same time when people are just, calling out to him all the time. Yeah. He was with his nephew one time, and they just were going through a hotel lobby. People were coming up and stuffing money into his pockets, and as soon as they would go outside and he'd see a beggar, he'd give it all away, even the coat off of his back. So he's extremely, extremely generous, and at the same time, he's filling himself up with our Lord in the Eucharist.
Yeah,
with it, very important for him.
Now, the issues that he faced weren't just in terms of the interior spiritual battle that he constantly made sure to stand up against. He also, there were certain external political, socio-political issues. You had World War II, you had the great rise of secularism and this movement away from this theological, or at least a kind of world view of God being at the center of the culture, and therefore the great rise of communism. And talk about some of the exchanges and the relationship that he had with Louis Francis Buden's, the American activist and communist writer.
Oh, yes. He had... Louis Buden's was a very, very interesting fellow. He was kind of like Bishop Sheen in that he was a Catholic boy from a Midwestern city, and he began to favor the underdog, and he thought eventually that the Catholic Church wasn't doing enough or fast enough to create this brotherhood of man, but that was the promise, really the euphoric promise of communism in those early days. And so he one time wrote an article against communism. He was directed by Pope Pius XI in the mid-30s he said, as long as I'm in my pontificate, I want you to always write against the communists. Mm-hmm. And so he had been writing against the communists, and he had quite a acerbic column that he put out against the communists. And of course, Louis Buden's, who was the editor of the Catholic Worker, the Daily Worker, had to respond to that. And so he was really, come, Monsignor. He wasn't a bishop yet at this time. Mm-hmm. Come, Monsignor. You will, join us in this fight. We will join this fight against fascism. And he talked to Buden's, called him up and said, let's meet for dinner. And so they did meet, and they discussed communism, and he was absolutely nonplussed to find out that Fulton Sheen knew much more about communism than he did. Sheen had read the Communist Constitution. He read everything written by Marx and Engels and anything that came out from Lenin. He was very well versed in that milieu because of what the Pope had told him, and also because of the Virgin had said, come pray for the conversion of Russia with Fatima. And Buden's believed everything he said, but he could not leave communism. It took him 8 more years to work his way to where he actually could leave the party. And he was terrified, of course, to leave the party because, some of them said, well, you never leave the party. you are thrown out or you're killed. You never leave the party. And if you leave the Catholic Church, you only lose your soul. But if you leave the Communist Party, you might lose your life.
Yeah.
So it was a constant fight for him. In fact, he had trouble with the producers of his radio show because he spent so much time railing against the communists.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a huge issue for him. He really, really worried that communism would destroy the United States, would destroy the Catholic Church, or I think at heart he knew that it couldn't destroy the Catholic Church because the Catholic Church is never going to be defeated because Jesus is our head.
Yep.
So, at any rate, it was just ongoing, and finally he went over. He did not have to take communion. He had been in an illicit or irregular relationship, so he had to take care of that. And his wife and his 3 daughters all converted. And bless his heart, Fulton Sheen got him out of town to Indiana, where he taught at Notre Dame, economics at Notre Dame for a while, before he moved on to some other places. But his main occupation, once he converted, was as anti-communism.
Cheryl, I want to say thank you so much for making the time to speak with us. This was but a snippet of the many things you uncover in Fulton Sheen's life. Thank you so much for talking with us.
Well, thank you so very much for having me. I enjoyed it tremendously.
My guest, Cheryl Hughes, author of Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen, Convert Maker, published by Ignatius Press. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.
When your children consider going to college, where are you going to find a place that will prepare them for the future and build on the foundation that you've laid? The answer? Ave Maria University. With an authentically Catholic curriculum, including 35 majors, AMU prepares students to take on the world.
My daughter told me she was published in a scientific journal as an undergrad. I'm so proud of her. The world needs Catholic physicists, and my daughter's going to be one of them.
Learn more at avemaria.edu. That's avemaria.edu.
Do you own popular index mutual funds or ETFs? If so, you're automatically own shares of companies that conflict with your moral beliefs. Ave Maria mutual funds are managed to conform to pro-life and pro-family values. Long-term investors can invest in the no-load Ave Maria mutual funds. The experienced professional portfolio managers make decisions based on investment fundamentals and pro-life values. You can learn more about Ave Maria mutual funds today at 866-AVE-MARIA or visit AveMariaFunds.com.
Steve Ray here. Next year's a Jubilee year, and we're going to celebrate it in Rome. But not only Rome. This is our Saints and Shrines of Italy pilgrimage, and joining us is our good friend Teresa Tamio.
Yes, Steve, fantastical. Walking through the holy doors, immersing ourselves in the deeply Catholic culture of Italy. I'll be joining you and Janet in Florence and Assisi.
Join us this May for the Jubilee year from Milan to Florence and much more, all the way to Rome.
Find the Ave Maria Radio travel tab at AveMariaRadio.net.
Support for this Ave Maria radio program comes in part by the non-for-profit St. Anthony Services. Are you shopping for mortgage products, Catholic investing, Catholic health, real estate, or estate planning? StAnthonyServices.org can help you find a Catholic professional for these needs. They regularly connect faithful citizens with faith-based professionals that share our Christian values. More information at StAnthonyServices.org or 877-LIFE-US1.
Christ is the answer, with Father John Riccardo.
John, chapter 8, verse 51. Jesus is in a discussion with some of the leaders of the Jews. They're talking about Abraham. Abraham lived 1,500 years before the time of Jesus. So in the course of the discussion, Jesus says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, if anyone keeps my word, he will never see death." He says that often in the Gospels. "He who keeps my word or believes in me will never die." To which the Jews say, "Now we know you have a demon." And they say, "Abraham died, as did the prophets. All the patriarchs, the great men and women of the history of Israel. All these people died, and you say, if anyone keeps my word, he will never taste death? Are you greater than our father Abraham, who died? And the prophets who died?" And Jesus says, "Your father Abraham rejoiced that he was to see my day. He saw it and was glad." To which the Jews say, "You are not yet 50 years old, and you've seen Abraham?" And Jesus answers, "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am."
The Heart of the Interior Life with Elizabeth Jingle.
Within the context of St. Ignatius of Loyola's spiritual masterpiece called The Spiritual Exercises, we find what is called the 14 Rules for the Discernment of Spirits. We may consider, where did St. Ignatius' spiritual teaching on discernment originate from? The following is from his autobiography, which highlights the moment his spiritual teaching on discernment is born, when his eyes were opened a little. Yet there was this difference. When he was thinking about the things of the world, he took much delight in them. But afterwards, when he was tired and put them aside, he found that he was dry and discontented. But when he thought of going to Jerusalem, barefoot and eating nothing but herbs and undergoing all the other rigors that he saw the saints had endured, not only was he consoled when he had these thoughts, but even after putting them aside, he remained content and happy. He did not wonder, however, at this, nor did he stop to ponder the difference, until one time his eyes were opened a little.
For more information, visit AveMariaRadio.net.
Good afternoon, welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. Days after the conclusion of the nearly month-long October gathering on the Synod on Synodality in Rome, talk and focus have shifted to movement into the reception or implementation phase, the language of the stage of reception. Joining me to have a conversation about the events of the Synod on Synodality and really getting a pulse of the sentiment of what lay people across the world understand about these proceedings is Carl Olson, editor of Catholic World Report and Ignatius Insight. He is also the author of this article, 7 Challenges to the Implementation of Synodality, on whatweneednow.substack.com. Carl, great to speak with you. How are you?
Hi, Marcus. Great to be with you. I'm doing well. Thank you.
It really is great to speak with you, and as is always the case, you're a voice of reason, and I'll be very honest. In the face of a lot of the events of the Synod on Synodality, ambiguity seems to be the only word of true coherence when it comes to the proceedings, largely because I think all the way up till the lowest level of its quote-unquote implementation, many people still don't quite understand what the Holy Father and the process means by synodality, let alone its implementation at the level of parishes and dioceses.
Well, I think the ambiguity is due in part because there's so many different definitions of synodality, right? One of the points I make in my piece is that it's almost as though synodality can mean anything to anybody, which the problem with that, honestly, is that it means ultimately nothing. I think that's one of the real problems is that, Pope Francis has said that he discusses synodality as listening. Well, that's wonderful. That's great. I don't think anybody is opposed to that. But then other people clearly see it as part of an agenda to perhaps change church teaching on, say, women deacons or even women priests, or maybe issues of sexual morality. Other people see synodality as a revamping or a changing of maybe protocols in how the Vatican works, how bishops interrelate with the Pope. I mean, there's so many different notions. I think some of these ideas are fine. Like, obviously, there should be more listening. It's good to have listening between bishops and lay people, priests and lay people. That's wonderful. But that was going on before, the Synod on Synodality. Yep. So it's clearly more than that. My sense is that the ambiguity comes from how the whole process was put together. That there was the idea we're just going to kind of throw everything against the kitchen wall, and then let's see what sticks. I mean, I say that, but I'm not being completely flippant. I think there's an aspect of that to this, and unfortunately, I think that has led to it undermining itself. In my view, in my opinion, I believe it's undermining itself in the long run because nobody really knows what it is, or they have differing notions about what it is, and there's not enough impetus behind one particular aspect that's really focused that will keep it going and alive, say, 5, 10, 20 years down the road.
And one of the things I greatly dislike about that analogy, although I think you're right, it's just that if you visualize the analogy, no matter how you swing it, whether something sticks or not, it's a waste of good pasta. And
it's a mess.
It's a mess. And so when I think about all these issues that are attempting to be discussed as a part of the entire process of the Synod on Synodality, like you are rightly bringing up, you wonder what the direction forward is. And by the way, I'm not being overtly cynical about this. This is an echoing of the statement of Cardinal Blaise Cupich of Chicago, that he knows, he admits that he has no idea how this is going to unfold, but he also calls it historic. And in my mind, being a student of history, very little happens in history when the leaders have no idea where they're going. So this anywhere from a cause of concern to a cause of at least pondering literally where this is going, the direction of all this.
Well, it reminds me of years ago when Nancy Pelosi said about this huge, bloated government budget. I forget the year what it was, but basically she said, well, we just need to pass it and then we'll figure out what it is afterwards, right? There's a little bit of that aspect to the Synod on Synodality, the final document, which is 30,000 words. Now, the final document, I will say real quickly, is definitely better than some of the earlier documents, which were truly horrible in so many ways. So there's a lot of good stuff in the final document. There's also a lot of dross, in my opinion.
Yep.
And I think that what is good in this final document, kind of speaking to your point about where we're going, is stuff that's already been said, whether in Vatican II documents, by John Paul II, by Benedict XVI. And so I think, first of all, to Cardinal Cupich's point, I think we have no real idea how this is going to work out. He can claim it's a historic event, but as you rightly note, historic events tend to actually have some specific quality or quantity.
Yep.
I mean, we think about great historic events. We have details. We have a real sense of what happened, what could have happened, why it's great. With the Synod and Synodality, what we have is a lot of kind of bureaucratic speak, a lot of sociological language, a lot of gatherings, meetings on meetings. I think when that, to use the analogy of people going to try to pan for gold, at the end of the day, I'm not sure how many nuggets are going to be in this. Now, I do think on a positive note, at the local level, I think this has been helpful in many cases. I think that you've had a lot of meetings with people at the, say, parish or diocesan level. From what I've heard from people, that many times this has been a very positive thing for them. But I think when you try to extrapolate this out worldwide and the way it was handled, the methodology that was employed, I don't see that being a positive in the end. I think there's just too many problems with it.
Which raises that concern that you brought up earlier, which is we've already seen different versions of, if I'm utilizing a proper definition of synodality here, I don't want to claim an expertise on the area, but if we talk about this notion of listening and of developing, especially at the level of the parish community, hearing concerns and developing from the ground up, a true exercise in the principle of subsidiarity in the spiritual family. We've all seen it work. I think everyone can attest to the fact that when parishes do things like that, it greatly bolsters not only participation, but a deepening of the spiritual mission of the parish. But the problem with this is that it's too grand a scale and it's too top-down, that I'm still waiting to see how this is going to greatly change the way parishes operate at the level of, say, down the road, the church I attend, to the diocese that I live in, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think your term top-down is really a key one there. I think that really nails it. I think that is one of the problems. I've been in an Eastern Byzantine Rite Catholic parish for 25 years, and of course in the East, synodality has been something that's been around for centuries, and it really speaks to the relationship of the bishops with each other and the bishops with the people. And in the East, it depends. I mean, historically, there's been a lot of variance, but there's been a little bit more of a, interaction between bishops and people on a lot of different levels. Again, that can vary. In the West, the way I put it, post-2015 synodality, again, is really ambiguous, and it's not even clear how closely related it is to Paul VI's notion of synodality with the bishops meeting with the Pope, et cetera. And so that's, to me, one of the big questions. You've taken a term that historically in the East and to a certain degree in the West has had a specific meaning, especially relating to the bishops and how they relate to one another. And then now we're trying to kind of apply it broadly to the church in a way that nobody really understands, and it seems to be kind of forced. I think, you use the term top-down, which I think is accurate. I would also add the term artificial. I think this has kind of been foisted as a way of trying to make something happen that nobody really knows what is happening and where that's going to lead. So, I mean, if I had to guess, I think 10 years from now, 20 years from now, I don't know that this is even going to be an issue. I mean, my sense right now is that for most Catholics, the term synodality means very little, and it has no real effect on their daily lives.
Right. And therein lies the issue, because going back to what we were talking about in terms of historic events, being a student of at least American history, let alone global history, I can't picture Washington and the Founding Fathers essentially saying, well, we don't know how this is going to unfold. We don't quite have a definition for what we're doing, but we hope for the best and let's go forth. We are continuing this conversation with Carl Olson, editor of the Catholic World Report and Ignatius Insight. We're talking about some observations we have about the entire process of synod and synodality and what are some issues, concerns, and maybe positive aspects that we can look forward to. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.
When your children consider going to college, where are you going to find a place that will prepare them for the future and build on the foundation that you've laid? The answer? Ave Maria University. With an authentically Catholic curriculum, including 35 majors, AMU prepares students to take on the world.
I've seen the difference in my son since he's been at Ave Maria. He's happy, he's excited about what he's going to do with his degree, and he's living his faith.
Learn more at avemaria.edu. That's avemaria.edu.
The Catholic Church teaches that Jesus Christ is literally and wholly present, body and blood, soul and divinity, under the appearances of bread and wine. St. John the Apostle records the John chapter 6 Bread of Life discourse, in which Jesus states that his flesh is true food and his blood true drink. Who better to understand John's writings and subsequent teachings than a disciple and student of John, St. Ignatius of Antioch? In his letter to the Smyrnians in 110 AD, Ignatius writes, "I have no taste for corruptible food, nor for the pleasures of this life. I desire the bread of God, which is the flesh of Jesus Christ. And for drink, I desire his blood, which is love incorruptible." The Catholic Church absolutely follows St. John and St. Ignatius in taking Jesus at his word. Examining the truths of the Catholic faith, this is faithforensics.org.
Ave Maria in the Afternoon is underwritten by the following nonprofit organization: Real Estate for Life. Buying or selling your home or business property? Real Estate for Life can connect you with one of 1,400 pro-life real estate agents around the world. When Real Estate for Life receives a referral fee, they donate 70% to Ave Maria Radio and Human Life International. More information at realestateforlife.org or 877-LIFE-US1. That's realestateforlife.org.
Catholic Connection with Teresa Tomeo.
The saints are very, very aware of us. Revelation 5 talks about the bowls of incense or the prayers of the saints. We ask them for their intercession, and they love praying for us. St. Therese said, "I'm going to spend my time in heaven doing good on earth." And the reason people are walking through this life of sainthood, they start as venerable, then move to blessed, and then move, God willing, to canonization, is because they're interceding. In other words, they're taking requests to Jesus on our behalf. The prayers of intercession to the saints result in miracles, confirmed miracles that are tested exhaustively. So the church is built on solid ground when it comes to the intercession of the saints.
Catholic Connections, Teresa Tomeo. Weekdays, 9 a.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio.
What does Oratio Dominica mean? It refers to a prayer that is, according to the Catholic Catechism, truly unique. It is of the Lord. As the only Son of God the Father, Jesus, in speaking the words his Father gave him, is the master of our prayer. In addition, as Word incarnate, Jesus, in his human heart, knows the needs of his human brothers and sisters. In revealing them to us, he is also the model of our prayer. Jesus, however, does not merely give us a formula to repeat mechanically. Jesus not only gives the words of the Our Father, he gives us the Spirit by whom the words become in us spirit and life. The prayer to our Father is inserted into the mysterious mission of the Son and the Spirit. This is Peggy Stanton, and this has been the Order of Malta's Minute with the Catechism.
Welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. My guest, Carl Olson, editor of Catholic World Report and Ignatius Insight. We are talking about the entire process of Synod on Synodality and just utilizing the lens of reason here to see where we've come from, what's going on right now, and perhaps even reasonably speculating where we might be going. So, Carl, we were talking earlier about this continued, the sempiternum process that you rightly highlight. One of the big issues with it is it still seems to be lacking cohesive driving force, cohesive thrust, and rightly so. By its own admission, the entire process admits that there's still a need to develop a theology of synodality. One would almost think that the theology of synodality had to have been developed first before we started talking about processes and implementation, because at the very least you'd have a concrete idea of how to move forward and where we're going.
Right, exactly. And I think, too, there has been a theology of synodality in the sense that when we go back over the 2,000-year history of the Church, and you look at what the nature of a synod is a council. It's a gathering. It has to do with the authority of the Church. It's related to the magisterium of the Church. It really comes down to how the Pope and the bishops interact with the deposit of faith and how they work in clarifying, proclaiming, and if necessary, defining truths that come from the deposit of faith. We cannot change the deposit of faith. That's set. That's not going to change. So I think the idea of now we're going to develop, as Pope Francis said, a theology of synodality. Now I can understand him in the sense of maybe deepening it, because we can always deepen our understanding of everything in the deposit of faith. But he almost says it, I think, in a sense of like, now we got to come up with, we have to come up with something. And if that's the case, then we're kind of in trouble, because we got the tail wagging the proverbial dog. And the open nature of it kind of speaks to me of an ongoing problem with this pontificate, which is that there's a sense of we've got to change things, and yet we're always assured that none of the changes are going to be contrary to the deposit of faith, and yet we're also assured by certain people, maybe not necessarily Francis himself, that these changes are going to be radical and groundbreaking and new and fresh and all this stuff. There's an inherent, I think, conflict. And I think the conflict speaks to these tensions within the different camps aligning themselves with Francis, to put it that way. I think Francis himself is kind of conflicted in how he approaches this, from the outside looking in, that he kind of encourages this, and yet when people start to push certain ideas, he immediately puts the brakes on, which is good in many ways, but there just seems to be conflicting messages and further confusion. I think that we have such a wealth of things from the Council, from John Paul II, from Benedict XVI, that the idea that we have to have a whole bunch of new stuff, so to speak, is kind of problematic to me. It's not that we just dwell on the past. That's not my point. It's just that we have so much to unpack over the last 50, 60 years as it relates to a hermeneutic of continuity, and yet now we have a pontificate that too often is self-referential, and I think that has kind of inflicted this synodal process as well.
So you've got that real issue. The fact is, when you take a look at documents coming out of this pontificate, it's very clear that it is by itself self-referential. But going back to the formal definition of synodality that you mentioned, that I believe the vast majority of Catholics understand that a synod typically is magisterial. So you're looking at bishops, cardinal bishops, in communion with the Pope, interacting with the deposit of faith, and continuing to teach, to unveil, to unpack these wondrous mysteries that have been handed down in an ever more applicable manner, without ever taking away from or adding to the foundational deposit of faith that we've received as our apostolic heritage. So we understand that. We at least seem to understand that. But I think it's safe to say, and I don't think I'm putting words in the Holy Father's mouth here, I think it's safe to say that that is not the Holy Father's understanding of synodality. When he talks about the need to develop a theology of synodality, and given the fact that this document, the final document that comes out of this entire synodal meeting in Rome, and he immediately puts it into his ordinary magisterium, it's very clear that because this was a synod that involved lay people, it involved people who were not bishops, even priests, sisters, and the like. And he puts this document into his ordinary magisterium. So his definition of synodality is significantly different than what we understand from the tradition. So fleshing that out is one issue, but then the methodology of implementation becomes an entirely expansive issue as a result of that.
Yeah, I think you've touched on something that if I had an eighth point that I would have added to my article, it would have been on this very point, which is something that Tracy, the great Australian theologian Tracy Rowland, and Douglas Bushman.
Oh, she's so underrated.
Theologian and catechist. I've talked to both of them about this, and the point that they made is you can't have. How should I put this? You have the synodality, like you say, you have lay people, you have this person, that person. A lot of these people, to be very frank, are not really equipped or accredited, I guess you would say, to be. Why are they the ones there? That could be a lot. There could be a lot of argument about that. But there's certain folks. It's like why are they there? Why is their voice equal to say that of a bishop? Right? There's a democratization of. A perception of democratization of magisterial work that I think is really problematic. That points, it kind of logically leads to where Germany is at. Now, Germany has taken it to an extreme. Pope Francis has pushed back on that. But again, here we are. I think, again, at a contradiction or an inherent tension that is caused by the way that this pontificate has worked, which is, we're not this. But then you look at what's happening and you say, well, you kind of are. I mean, this is what you're presenting. So I think there's a real issue there with now. I was kind of relieved to see in this final document and the previous document before that, the working document immediately that came out before, a much greater emphasis on the role of bishops, on the Petrine ministry, et cetera. That was welcome because early on, the documents were so wide open. It was the sense of some of the early documents, like 2021-22, was, hey, everybody has an equal say in what the church is going to be doing and believing. And I'm not really exaggerating that. It was pretty bad. And that's obviously is not how the church works. The church is hierarchical in nature because Jesus Christ himself is the head of that hierarchy, that ordering of authority. And it has to work that way precisely because of the nature of its head and founder. And so that, you've touched on something I think is a really, really key point there.
And just to expand some of the points you brought up, Carl, I think fundamentally, when you take a look at the entire mission of the church, I'm going to use some big words here, and I don't mean the rhyme, but if her teleology is not soteriological, then any effort that she has is ultimately futile. So one has to hope that whatever the efforts of the Synod on Synodality is, it has to be fundamentally and finally geared towards the eternal salvation of souls. And so even as we're talking about this thing fleshing out, we still don't know what the implementation is going to look like. There are a couple of things that we have to hold on to, which is the perennial reality of the deposit of faith, that it can never alter, and therefore, by Christ's own words, it will never alter. The problem is, in all the documents that we're seeing right now, we're not seeing that kind of hard language of, like you mentioned, Christology, soteriology, this kind of teleological vision of the church, the renewed impetus for evangelization to the salvation of souls, repentance. And so, again, it remains to be seen what that implementation is going to look like at an evangelical level.
Yeah, I think one of the really big problems with some of these early documents, and it was addressed a little bit in the final document, and not nearly strong enough in my opinion, is that when you read Lumen Gentium from Vatican II on the nature of the church, and even Gaudium et Spes, which of course has kind of been, a lot of people like to kick at it because it's got some, interesting. Yeah. The point of those documents is that the church is a sacrament of salvation, and that it always leads to the kingdom. It always leads to the salvation of souls. It is eschatological in nature. That is, it points to our end as individuals and as a whole. And that is the ultimate goal, to have communion with God for eternity. And a lot of these, in the early documents, you wouldn't even know that. I mean, you would think that the goal of church is to sit around and talk about your problems, complain a bit, push for your personal agenda, and then come back and do more of that later. It was kind of that bad in the early documents. It's certainly better in the final document, precisely because it actually brings in some sections from Lumen Gentium, which kind of goes back to my point that it's already been done better previously. And so the danger of the church becoming, it's really ironic. The Synod ostensibly was put together so that we could, the church would be better at going out on its mission. I mean, the term mission is used a lot in the documents, and yet I found that it kind of undermined that, because it kind of created this sense of the church is kind of a debating society where we bring all of our complaints and we just whine and complain, and like, oh, well, my lived experience is so this and my lived experience is so that, as opposed to, hey, guess what? I'm a sinful person who's been redeemed and saved by Jesus Christ, and now I should go and proclaim that good news of salvation. And that kind of really got lost, especially early on. And then when it does bring it back, which I'm glad it did, it still doesn't do it in a way that's robust, in a way that I see in Lumen Gentium. I mean, I think Lumen Gentium is an exceptional document. I wish more Catholics would read it and really contemplate it, because it's far better than any of the documents that came out of this whole 3-4 year process, right? So,
well, Carl, thank you so much for making the time to speak with us.
Thanks, Marcus.
My guest, Carl Olson, editor of Catholic World Report and Ignatius Insight. And, just to put a neat little bow in this conversation, Lumen Gentium has to be the interpretive key for how we view the Synod and Synodality. We ought to think about all these things in light of eternal salvation. So whatever happens in the Synod and Synodality, thank God for the protection of Christ. Thank you for listening. I'm Marcus Peter.